On August 1st at the In-N-Out restaurant in Twin Falls, Idaho, there was a chaotic scene of terror and violence. By now, you've probably seen some of the viral footage of what happened. 3 people were killed, 10 were injured. And under the FBI criteria, this was an active shooter event. But there's still a lot of unanswered questions. The investigation continues, and we still don't know why Chad Williams did this. What we can do is talk about the response. I'm John. I'm an active 911 dispatcher, and I'm joined by Drew, a police officer of 29 years. So what happens when people fight back? When police arrive and multiple people have guns, how do they know who's the shooter? And how does 911 make sense of chaos that's changing by the second? There's a lot of questions in this case. If you have any for us, make sure that you leave them in the comments section. Before we get into that, let's see what happened on the timeline. Chad Williams was 26-year-old and originally from Arizona. He attended school in Idaho for just a year with ambition to become a nurse or enter the healthcare field. Instead, he decided to define his life by harming other people rather than by helping them. This means that he was not like a great number of people in Twin Falls, Idaho. On August 1st, 2026, the suspect drove a white Honda Civic into the drive-thru of the brand new In-N-Out burger located at 1965 Blue Lakes Boulevard North. At approximately 2:29 p.m., the suspect reached the payment window. He lowered his driver's side window, pulled out a handgun, and shot In-N-Out employee Ashley Garibay. Ashley was alive after the shooting, but she would later succumb to her injuries at the hospital. The suspect rolled up his window, drove forward approximately 15 feet, and stopped. He then got out of his vehicle, walked toward the car in front of him, and shot Christopher Conch, who was pronounced dead at the scene. At that moment, former Twin Falls police officer and former Idaho State Trooper Austin James ran towards the danger. James encountered the suspect and was shot in the arm. James retreated, drew his handgun, and prepared to re-engage the shooter. However, because of the severity of his injury and blood loss, he was unable to continue the fight and was transported to the hospital. He survived. Even though he engaged the subject only briefly, he may have allowed someone else to get away or to seek cover. Thank God he was there. The suspect then returned to the payment window. Employees inside the window were trying to save Ashley Garibay's life. He fired into the window a second time before the handgun malfunctioned. Apparently, it jammed, and he didn't attempt to clear the malfunction. The suspect returned to his Honda Civic, left the handgun behind, and took out a rifle. Inside the restaurant, an off-duty Idaho State Trooper began evacuating employees and customers while searching for the threat. The suspect returned to the drive-thru window with the rifle and fired at customers who appeared to be trapped in the lane. He then returned to the payment window for a third time. This time, he encountered resistance. The off-duty Idaho State Trooper exchanged gunfire with the suspect through the payment window. Apparently, the suspect expected unharmed, helpless people, and instead he encountered armed and well-trained resistance, and it knocked him back on his ass. There's a lesson here. The suspect then moved away from the window before returning a fourth time. He fired inside again, striking an unarmed Good Samaritan who was attempting to help Ashley and render aid. Firing through windows at helpless people seemed to be his style. The suspect moved towards the food window, but after seeing no one inside, continued away from the restaurant. A woman fleeing from inside the restaurant ran alongside the building through the drive-thru lane. As she reached the back of the suspect's Honda Civic, she encountered him. She took cover behind the vehicle and found the handgun that the suspect had abandoned. She attempted to use it, but discovered that it was malfunctioning. She dropped the weapon and escaped in the opposite direction. If you're not familiar with firearms, it's not safe or wise to try to clear a jam, but you have to imagine she picked it up in order to defend herself and others. There's lessons everywhere in this story. The suspect continued towards Blue Lakes Boulevard North. At the intersection, he fired at vehicles stopped at a red light. 3 people were wounded, more helpless people, easy targets through windows. The suspect then continued north toward the Tesla charging station. At the charging station, the suspect encountered another armed person who refused to simply run away. A 35-year-old armed citizen named Jorda Salinas engaged the suspect with a FN-57 pistol. Sadly, the suspect was not struck, but once again he encountered resistance, which surprised him. Thank God Jordan was there. He approached a Tesla and fired into the vehicle, wounding an occupant. He then fired into a second Tesla, killing Dale Schultz and wounding his passenger. The suspect continued through the parking lot towards the Twin Falls Visitor Center. The first responding officer then arrived on scene and was directed towards the suspect by the off-duty Idaho State Trooper. Thank God he was there. Inside the visitor center, 3 people were unable to evacuate and sheltered inside while the suspect entered the building. The suspect searched the area but did not locate them. He eventually exited near Canyon Rim Trail. Employees from nearby businesses had evacuated onto that trail because they believed that the shooter was in the front parking lot. One of those employees was 17-year-old Braxton Stubby, who worked at Dick's Sporting Goods located just west of the In-N-Out. The suspect encountered the 2 employees there on the trail. Braxton stopped and spoke to him.
Said, I have a family. I said, you don't have to do this. I'll tell you whatever you want. I'll do anything. I'll tell you what you want. And that's when he started to like tear up a bit, it seemed like, and kind of just got like emotional, it seemed like. And he said to me, just get away from me, man.
The suspect eventually fired in Braxton's direction and continued running along the trail, but not before others on the trail were able to see that encounter and run the other direction. With uncommon bravery, Braxton, while unarmed, approached the madman as a person and made an appeal to his humanity. Braxton put on a face for all the people that the suspect had been firing on. Thank God Braxton was there. Officers pursued the suspect along the trail, searching the pathway, construction areas, and canyon edge, while also dealing with reports of a possible second shooter. There were just 2 911 dispatchers on duty, and they were handling 85 calls about the incident. Some reports are bound to conflict with others. We're trained to recognize multiples, whether it's car accidents or active shooters, and so we're not going to screen out intelligence that suggests more bad guys and potentially increase the danger to the units in the field. An officer located the suspect near the trailhead. That officer gave him verbal commands and ordered him to show his hands. The suspect then died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound and fell dramatically into the canyon. In total, the suspect killed 3 people and wounded 7 others. He hurt a community and families across the country. And he revealed the bravery of so many good people in Idaho. The last lesson to take away from this is that Chad Williams was far outnumbered by them. As a police officer of 29 years, what jumps out at you right away when you watch that maybe other people are not noticing?
I don't think he was strongly or tactically trained. And you know, we've seen other active shooter incidents. Unfortunately, like I hate that we have this discussion, even that, you know, like we have comparisons, that we have like a standard that we can compare this kid to, because he was essentially a kid. He did not look like the typical trained active shooter, like he had been around guns his whole life or something to that effect. He looked like a video gamer. Yeah. He looked like he was playing you know, just something online with his buddies and taking people out. Yeah, you know, and it's not even an indictment on video games or any, you know, like I'm not trying to be that deep. I'm just saying that's the vibe this kid is giving off.
Well, he looks terrifying when he's attacking people, but when people start fighting back, it seems to take him by surprise. I mean, what does that tell you about the expectations that he had going into this?
Well, it should tell everybody about the expectation of some of the things that we've been teaching or taught about active shooter response as a citizen. Like the run, hide, fight is pretty common. It's commonly discussed. Like just leave your stuff behind, get out of there, hide if you can't. But the fight part is to disrupt. And there was a lot of disruption. I think that there's a very interesting debate brewing in this case alone, because I know, and we're not taking a stance either way here. Like we're fans of the Constitution, and the Second Amendment is an amendment to the Constitution. But there are people that will jump on this and say, well, we need to limit guns, and this is a classic reason why. But maybe you're not looking at the other half of this, because if we limited guns, we wouldn't have been able to stop this kid. This kid was actually out there committing a crime, and he was going to get a hold of a gun either way to commit that crime. It was the law-abiding people that ended up stopping him, disrupting him, and doing all this other stuff. So, you know, if there's a gun debate to be had, it kind of negates itself, like right in this own, or right within this, the whole situation right here.
Yeah, the woman who was running outside the restaurant, she saw that a pistol had been discarded, and she saw it as something valuable to be picked up, not something to be fearful of and to run away. When he tossed down the malfunctioning pistol, when and the off-duty trooper who fired back at him, doesn't this kind of just show you that he maybe didn't fully understand what it was like to operate firearms under stress? He was just somebody that had guns.
Yeah, that is exactly how I take this. Like, and I could be completely wrong about this kid. I have no clue. There's a lot of unanswered questions about this case in itself. Who this kid was, what motivated him, why he chose an In-N-Out burger. I think it's very curious that the first two victims were from California, which is In-N-Out was born in California. Kind of a conservative-based chain. I don't know why he chose that, but ironically, the person in the drive-thru that he unfortunately shot and killed, and the person who was the customer sitting in the drive-thru who he unfortunately shot and killed, were both from the same area of California. Like, they were fans and supporters of the In-N-Out process, I guess.
Yeah.
So, you wonder if that's part of his motivation, but it seemed like he didn't, perhaps he got a taste of like things are very different than when you're watching this on a TV screen versus when you're doing this in real life. And he got that dose of reality pretty quick.
You're right. Attacking the notably conservative Christian-based In-N-Out restaurant, and then, of course, owners of Teslas. The association with Elon Musk may be something suggestive of his motives, but he also did attack a visitor center. Seems like maybe he was just going after people in general. But how much do you think that the armed off-duty trooper and Jordan Salinas, by having firearms and being able to sort of repel and disrupt his attack, how much do you think that they were able to do simply to repel his rampage just by getting involved with that with firearms?
Yeah, this is immeasurable. And I hate speculating, especially on cases like this, or I hate playing the what ifs. But it seemed that he was very successful in what he was doing at that moment. Had his handgun not jammed, he would have been able to run through that whole thing. I saw that he also had a full backpack that he pulled out of the trunk of his white Honda there. So who knows what was in that. But when he grabbed the rifle, he was able to continue the fight. When he was confronted by somebody who knew what they were doing with a handgun, it totally changed the course of what he was doing. It's complete disruption. And that's one of the things that we trained in active shooter. Like, look, your job is to neutralize the threat in any way that you can. It just means, get to the shooter and stop the shooting. So in this instance, whatever the disruption was, they tried their best to stop the shooting. I know that the one former officer was shot in the arm, and so he was kind of incapacitated, but that's a slowdown as well. That's a disruption as well.
Going back to the police angle of this, it's a nightmare for responding police. Police officers get on scene of the In-N-Out. You've got the off-duty trooper there who's armed. You've got Jordan Salinas in the area. He's armed. How do you determine which one of these guys is the shooter? The off-duty trooper looked like anybody else. The suspect in this case was dressed in a t-shirt and jeans. He looked like somebody who was there to buy a hamburger. How do police officers sort that out in the midst of all that chaos?
Yeah, this is going to be I want to do a whole line of questions for you as the 911 professional and how you handle active shooters, because I don't think we talk about this enough. Whether we've talked about it a million times on this show, I still don't think that we talk about it enough. So that's going to be a question that you can answer. However, the tactical side of this, the reality is you don't, unless you have a full description from the people that were calling in. And in this case, there were patrons that responded to what was actually happening. They were able to point out what he looked like. They were able to follow him, and they were, luckily, they were able to point out what he was wearing. They were able to physically point him out at the visitor center to the armed officers arriving. But that first officer getting there, that's like, you think that your heart beating and your adrenaline is through the roof just getting that call. Then being the first one there, it doubles. And then being the first one to encounter somebody armed, and you don't know if it's the shooter or somebody that's trying to help you, it quadruples. And then he's pointing at somebody else. So you're having to communicate all this information, keep it straight and keep that adrenaline tame, like keep that beast tame so you can effectively communicate to the other responding officers, get him cordoned off, like stop the killing. Like let's get a perimeter around him somehow. And little did they know he had slipped out the back onto the path there.
Yeah. The suspect obviously chose this environment because it was a target-rich environment. There's lots of people for him to threaten. Unfortunately, it's the same for police officers arriving on scene. There's lots of danger. There's lots of innocent people there that they don't want to hurt. Would you as a police officer want armed citizens actually pursuing the active shooter? Where does helping end, and how does it create more danger for the other responding officers to see all these armed citizens running around with guns?
Yeah, in planning for war, the first thing that goes to hell is the plan. So we can train each other as cops. We can train citizens on how to respond, but every single one of them is completely different, and every single one of them needs to be treated completely differently. No pun intended, a loaded question to ask whether I would want an armed citizen chasing down an active shooter. That's not necessarily part of the run, hide, fight, but at the same time, this is an era where see something, say something. If you're not going to be active, if you're not going to actively participate in the rescue or saving fellow man, you can expect more people to be injured. And, hats off to that woman who ran between the cars in the drive-thru, picked up the gun that had been jammed, and did her best to return fire. Like, I don't know if she was firearm trained or what, or I don't know who she is. Hopefully she's getting her proper due, but it takes some guts to risk your life to defend others. We saw it in Marjorie Stoneman Douglas too, with Aaron Fleiss, the coach, that, he risked it all to prevent anything else from happening. So as far as encouraging somebody to chase somebody down, I don't know. It's a very tough call. It's that's another question I want to ask you when we get to the segment of what do you actually talk to first active shooter callers about?
It's a paradoxical situation because a community is being overwhelmed by violence, and that violence is going to continue until the community, whether the police officers or citizens, overwhelm that violence with more violence. In other words, the gun violence, the gunshots are not going to stop until we neutralize the attacker. And we can only meet him on his own terms, which means returning fire. So when you're asking the question, what's the right thing to do, there's not a catch-all answer as to terms of what's correct. It's you do the best you can while trying to balance out risk and danger in second by second as the situation evolves. As police officers are responding to this, how is it that we can identify the attacker and not mistake him for somebody else? Is that where you really rely on your 911 dispatchers to get that description, Drew? Yeah,
you definitely want to rely on that. How did the initial call come out? And it's so difficult for you. So I'm going to put a question onto you. What do you think that they actually heard? How did they shape the response? And do me a favor and explain, because it was mentioned in the clip, there were only 2 dispatchers working at the time. I know that you have worked in a center where there were only 2 of you working, and just to propose a scenario, if the active shooter call comes in, what happens? Do you divvy up the, what are you listening for? What are you asking? What questions are you asking? Because I don't think people understand the overwhelm that occurs, and I think only you can really explain it.
Well, they took 85 calls in the opening minutes of this attack, and when you have 2 dispatchers, one's essentially working on the phone, the other one's putting things out on the radio. Now, both dispatchers will answer 911 calls, but at some point, you have to stop answering 911 calls because you can take in information, and it doesn't do you any good in the comm center until you start disseminating that information in the field. That means one dispatcher has to stop taking phone calls and start putting information out. He's going to be heavily reliant on the CAD and listening to the other phone call, kind of split ear. He's hearing multiple things at the same time, using all of his brain to process information and start putting it out. But mostly what we need is a description of that person. Now, actually, it's very difficult to get descriptions of people over the phone because people will give you generalities like it's a guy, a younger guy. And, what does that mean? Does it mean he's 15? Does it mean he's 35? Both of those guys are younger than me. So you have to narrow that in. We're talking about a male, and then people are very hesitant to say what the race of a person is. So you have to usually give them a few options, like you're showing a few cards: Caucasian, Native American, Hispanic, Black, whatever. And then you'll get that. And then I try to just get top and bottom in a situation like this. What color is his shirt, what color is his pants? And normally someone would say, well, isn't that enough? It's the guy with the gun. But this is the situation we've talked about so often, Drew, where 911 dispatchers on other calls that we're listening to, they get criticized for asking too many questions. And then people will say, well, the police should obviously come, show up, and cook the guy who's threatening other people. But now we're in an environment where Twin Falls is responding with force. Lots of people. Jordan Salinas, this off-duty trooper that looks like he's on his way home from the golf course. We've got to have a good description of what that person looks like. And so having additional details, what color is his hair? Is it cut long or short? Does he have glasses? Things like that. But in addition to that, it's not just enough to have that. We've got to have some idea of where this guy's located, what side of the restaurant is he on, and what side is he moving to. And as these calls come in, Drew, they're going to begin to populate a map. We have rapid SOS and other things, and it's going to start showing the locations of these 911 calls. And it's almost going to create kind of a heat map for witnesses who have seen this person. So as he leaves the restaurant, walking eastbound towards the boulevard where he opened fire on all the people sitting in cars at the stoplight, we're going to get 911 calls from people who are out on that road. Well, all of a sudden we can kind of, just without talking to anybody, understand that this guy's out from the restaurant. He's moved towards the street. Now he's taking pot shots at cars. And then as we start taking 911 phone calls from the Tesla lot, which is to the north of the restaurant, we're going to see, well, he turned back the other direction. Now he's in the Tesla charging station. We're getting reports of shots fired there. And then finally, by the time he's approaching the visitor center had heard all of this. News had gotten to them. They'd heard the gunshots from far away. They were able to evacuate. At that point, we have an idea that he's going up there. But in areas like this, I don't know how Twin Falls is with cameras and things like that. Other cities have more. Some places have less. They might not be able to have like a real-time crime information center located. But you're just going to be completely dependent on 911 phone calls. I would guess that somewhere where you just have 2 911 dispatchers working, that's what you're going to have. But the 911 calls that don't get answered, that's going to scare a lot of people because they're dialing 911. It's ringing and ringing and ringing. That is going to kick back to a backup center. I'm guessing it's going to go to county 911. And from there, they probably even have something in another county or at state radio answering those calls. So we're designed to be able to scale up to handle an emergency like this, but that does not mean that it's easy. And since we never practice in a realistic way for something like this, it's always going to be hard. And God bless those 2 911 dispatchers for doing a phenomenal job. I know that both the sheriff and the chief of police in Twin Falls recognize them for their hard work, Drew.
I know that you somewhat just explained it in there. I want to ask you this question directly so we can kind of meet this out a little bit. What does happen when a 2-person 911 center is overwhelmed like that? What happens to the remaining phone calls? I know that you mentioned just a minute ago that the phone might ring and ring and ring, but you also mentioned an overflow. Can you explain that just a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we want our 911 calls answered first ring. We want them answered within a few seconds. It's not possible if one person's already on a 911 call and trying to get valuable information about the suspect. But don't forget that we're also trying to get information about injuries. We've got people with gunshot wounds. We've got to not only get information of the number of people shot, but try to give advice to them, trying to put direct pressure on all this. So we have 911 calls that are ringing and ringing and ringing. And it's set by every agency, but after a predefined time, it automatically will bounce to the next backup center, which I'm guessing is county at this point. At that point, county would normally answer it. If this was a smaller incident, county would answer that 911 call, and then they would take down details, and then they would refer it back to city resources. They would sort of act as a time delay buffer zone in which somebody in the emergency response apparatus is aware of it. They've talked to somebody on the 911 call. We have some idea of what's happening. Somebody with the radio can communicate what they learned on the 911 call, but it's very difficult to make that kind of a faster process. And even so, you're still reacting to something that's overwhelming you. You're not really fully responding. There's probably a lot of 911 phone calls that just got abandoned. At a certain point, people will hang up. They'll stop trying. They'll start focusing on what they're doing. And those people will eventually get calls back to make sure that they're okay. But how much time has passed by that point, Drew?
Okay, so just a couple observations. You saw in the clip that in front of the In-N-Out restaurant, there was a sign that said, "Welcome to Twin Falls, Idaho." That indicates that's probably like right near a city line or a county line. And sometimes cell phone calls don't directly go to the right call center. And we just talked about the overflow situation where if it went to the right center and there's an overflow of calls, it would probably, just go to the next largest agency or whatever. But is there communication between those 2 entities that are receiving these phone calls? Are you guaranteed that if you're working this active shooter, you and your partner, there are two of you answering all these 911 calls, it starts overflowing to the county, let's say, and they have 4, maybe 6 people answering 911 calls. What's the guarantee that you're getting the same information they're getting and the response is all going to marry up?
There's no guarantee at all. And I think county actually only had 2 911 dispatchers working as well. If you think about it, the number of people that are in the outlying area in the county is probably fewer than are in the city. So they're not going to have more. But we don't have any guarantees that information is going to correspond at all. In fact, this is the fog of war. You have people calling in. They're scared. We know that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. 2 people could see the exact same thing and report on it very differently. At one point, Drew, the police officers are responding to the scene and they're getting reports of a second shooter. I mentioned that in the video. That could be the scariest thing, because the idea is that all of a sudden you have first responders, which included firefighters and paramedics, all converging on the In-N-Out, and decent citizens, by the way, all going to that same place to help out gunshot victims. They were getting reports from their friends over Instagram and things like that. They were responding to the scene before police officers even found them. But now we're adding people to that environment. And if a second shooter shows up, we know that the second attack is not only going to be more dangerous because we already have people down, we already have people wounded, but the helpers are in danger of being injured or wounded. And so what happens is you just have to kind of do the best you can. You have to kind of look at information. There is a judgment call to be made at some point if you're hearing something that you know is wrong. But if you can't necessarily exclude a piece of information, such as there's a second shooter, you've got to put that information out there. And that can cause significant delays as well, right? After the police responded to Chad Williams and he ended his own life, at that point you would like police officers to return to the scene and start performing first aid, but they're on the lookout now for a second shooter that doesn't exist. And that happened because at some point information got duplicated. There was enough difference. There was a delay. There was a different report about what somebody looked like. The information was different enough that it convinced a 911 dispatcher to err on the side of caution and to advise units in the field that there may be additional danger that they had to respond to. And there's no way to avoid that. In a situation this chaotic, you're always going to have a breakdown of information, fracturing of information, and confusion. And all you could do is respond to that the best you can. They searched the area. They found out there was no more threats involved. And then the police officers did respond to the scene to start tending to the wounded, Drew.
With multiple 911 calls coming in from different vantage points, we've already established that. You talked about how Rapid SOS might even like create a little map for you, a heat map at least. So different vantage points inside the restaurant. Also understanding that people are calling while the guy's on the move, but they're calling about what they see in front of them. Therefore, they're calling about the rescue efforts of the young lady that was shot in there. But if you're trying to get an accurate picture to get out to the scene, is there anything that you're like specifically listening for that the average citizen wouldn't think about?
When you take a 911 call, you're trying to gather as much information from the caller as possible, but you can't get it all fast enough. There's no way that you can rattle through a question and answer session at a speed that someone's able to match you, that they're able to give you the information, that they're able to answer the question exactly as you're asking it fast enough. I've fascinated lately, Drew, I've been taking a lot of reports for animal bites, and when I ask the nurse where it happened, instead of them telling me the town that it happened, and they say, oh, she was bitten on the finger. You can ask a question and it can be totally misunderstood, and you waste a lot of time re-asking questions of people. And so when you're talking to people and they're already frightened and they're already disoriented, and sometimes, Drew, people are calling 911 because that's just what you do. It's not because they know anything helpful. It's not because they have anything to offer in terms of actionable intelligence. They call because they see somebody bleeding. They call because they need to feel like they need to do something. They call because they're scared and they want to rely on a source of authority and knowledge and caring, which is exactly what a 911 dispatcher is. And so you could be in a situation like this, Drew, where you're talking to someone on the phone and they're giving you a pretty good description, last known direction of travel, and then at some point you have to decide, what else can this guy give me? What point do I hang up and try to see if the next 911 call that's ringing right now, do they have better or more information for me? Is it from someone who's further down the line that can see this guy walking towards them, that's going to be able to tell me what's happening next in this unstoppable, train accident, this chain of events that keeps happening? Or is it going to be a 911 phone call for, sadly, someone who's looking down at someone who's already been shot, and the only thing that they have to tell me is someone's been shot? I don't mean this in a mean way, but it's just like, I know that, telling me that at this point, doesn't help me stop what's happening. We've got to stop what's happening. I want to respond. I care about everybody that's been hurt in this attack. I want to get every resource there. In fact, dispatchers, both at the city and the county level, put out a call for mutual aid from many surrounding communities, whether it was Magic Valley, at Kimberly and some of these other places. We had ambulances and fire trucks all going into the hot zone from all around Twin Falls. It wasn't just Twin Falls that responded, but we've got to try to stay focused on getting the actionable intelligence inside the comm center. We've got to stay in our lanes. We've got to try to be going in the same direction, but not stepping on each other's toes. And you just do the best you can. And every time this happens, Drew, there's usually a debrief to see what could have gone better. And you learn the lesson, but also you tacitly think, there's nothing that I could have done better in that moment. There wasn't a choice that I made that was wrong. I did the best I could all along the way, Drew. And that's what you try to remember for next time.
Yeah, just like the cops, you're always going to be judged in hindsight. Like this stuff rapidly unfolds. It is a Niagara Falls of information that is coming into a 911 center, and it's just as bad, when you're on the scene, because we even talked about the reports of a second shooter. Well, the reports of that second shooter was either the off-duty trooper or it was the woman that decided to stand. Like it was an innocent somebody that was trying to help. So I don't want to call it misinformation, but it's hard to triage information that's coming in at that rate and try to decide which is more pertinent than the next and get to the next call. But the Dix employee that talked to Williams on the trail said, and I know you have experience in this on a couple different levels. He said that he was becoming emotional, that Williams was becoming emotional. Can human interaction sometimes interrupt the mental script of, say, somebody committing like a crime of extreme violence like this one?
Yeah, that's essentially what crisis negotiations is. I'm also a crisis negotiator, more colorfully known as a hostage negotiator. When you have something like this, you try to attempt to make contact with the suspect, which, by the way, this guy, Braxton Stubby, 17 years old. He's going to grow up to be a hell of a guy, but he was right there. He knew that he was dead to rights. He said that he hoped nothing would happen to him, but he was there, and all he could do was talk. And he stopped and talked to him and said, I have a family. You don't have to do this. He offered alternatives. He put a human face on it right away. We do the same thing in crisis negotiations, right? Whenever a suspect has taken control of a situation because they have force, they have an advantage, a tactical advantage, they have a hostage, whether it's just themselves or other people, the police are not in charge of that situation. We're trying to buy time to find a way to use special weapons and tactics in order to take back control of that situation, which means to arrest the bad guy, to preserve everyone's lives, to get everything back under control. And that can take time. One of the ways that we do that is by disrupting them, is reminding them of their humanity. When I call them, I'm not going to say, hello, my name is dispatcher so-and-so, and I'm with such and such sheriff's office, and try to push some kind of badge or authority through the phone to this guy. I'm going to say, John, and I'm calling. My name's John, and I'm calling because I care about you. What's happening there? How did we get to this point? And I'm going to try to get them to think of their own lives, what's going wrong, get them to talk to me, to think about the future, to think about alternatives of their terrible plan, and to think about the aspects of life that maybe that they have been pushing aside in order to mentally prepare themselves for this. And to Braxton's credit, he was able to talk to him long enough that people were on that trail. They saw him coming and they turned and ran the other direction. If Braxton had just run away, the suspect would have likely walked up that trail, and one of them even looked like a kid. He would have encountered 3 or 4 people there, and they would have been nothing to him to simply point a weapon and shoot at. But because Braxton was able to negotiate the way that we do as police officers, by being a human being and by disrupting that pattern of violence, not necessarily to even necessarily accomplish something, but to buy time. He demonstrated what we do. But Drew, he did it without a gun. He did it face to face. There's really not enough to say about just the extreme courage of this young man. It's something that you won't find in somebody my age. And it's just something to be extremely proud of. And I think he's a great example of that community. There were many heroes that day, lots of people that responded with force, certainly the off-duty trooper, the ex-police officer in line and In-N-Out. But we had a 17-year-old employee of a sporting goods store who was able to put himself out there and do what none of the other people did, which was talk to him. Meaning we responded to this act of violence in multiple ways. We responded with force, trying to overwhelm him to stop it, and we responded with humanity, trying to stop him. We did everything that we could in that community, the Twin Falls community did, and I think they're to be applauded, Drew.
Okay, so the through line here is the motive is still unconfirmed. The trooper is still unnamed. All of this is still developing, and that's kind of what we're watching for next. The family really hasn't addressed the media. It's not that they owe anybody any explanations either, but we'll be there to cover it when it happens, if and when it happens. What we want to know, though, is from you. What questions specifically do you have about this case and or active shooter response, either in a 911 center or from a law enforcement officer? Just put those comments down, or just put those questions down in the comments section. I'm glad to answer those in a subsequent episode. Even we could build an entire episode around that. John?
Yeah, if you guys do have questions for how 911 handles something like this or anything else, make sure you leave it in the comments section below. Drew actually stays up all night long. His phone emits a beeping tone whenever one of you leaves a comment, and he wakes up and he immediately responds to it, even at 4 in the morning.
Yes.
Make sure you check out a bunch of the other videos that we have on this channel if you like this content. Make sure you hit like and subscribe. We'd appreciate it if you would do us a favor, hit like and subscribe so that YouTube will show this to other people just like you. Drew, any final thoughts before we go?
That's it. Catch you on the next one.
All right, guys, have a good one.